Thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview with us in المجلة. It's a pleasure to have you in المجلة online.
Good to be with you.
I think the way I would like, if that's okay with you, the way I would like to conduct this interview is like to ask you a few questions on certain events happening the last few days, and then we can zoom out to look at strategic perspective. So let us start with the visit of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to Washington, his meeting with Trump, and agreements between Washington and Riyadh. What do you make out of this visit?
Well, we'll know the specific results, very shortly. The president and the Crown Prince will be meeting any minute now, but it's clear that this will focus on the bilateral relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. It appears that F-35 advanced aircraft will be sold to Saudi Arabia. There's likely to be some type of a security arrangement. I presume it will be modeled somewhat on the arrangement with Qatar that was signed several weeks ago. There'll be Saudi investment in the United States. There will be some transfer of technology and investment from the United States into Saudi Arabia. I think more broadly what the agreement reflects is the idea that U.S.-Saudi relations are advancing, and this is an administration that, how would I put it, is not going to let concerns over human rights or democracy get in the way. That process already began actually under the Biden administration. I also think it represents, from Saudi Arabia's point of view, a kind of what I would describe as Saudi-first foreign policy, a greater emphasis on development in Saudi Arabia, U.S.-Saudi relations, and a de-emphasis on certain regional issues. It's interesting, this visit comes less than 24 hours after the UN Security Council passed a resolution, which obviously takes the 20-point plan and gives it a UN imprimatur and so forth. But again, one gets the sense from all reports is that for the Saudis, they no longer want the relationship with the United States to, or more broadly, they really no longer want Saudi Arabia's future to be tightly connected to regional developments and dependent on them. I think they would like to have, to some extent, put themselves in a position where they can emphasize their own security and development. I think there's an open question, and again, we'll know soon enough whether the two sides can come to agreement on Saudi participation in the so-called 20-point plan. And my own reading of it is it's unlikely at this point that the Saudis would participate in a stabilization force. Unlikely they would open up their checkbooks in any meaningful way to rebuild Gaza at this point. And indeed, I think we'll see what happens. But my own sense, if the past is prologue, that they want to see certain progress made towards a Palestinian state before they would be prepared to become a member or participant in the Abraham Accords.
I will come back I will come back to Gaza plan, but let me ask one question about the Saudi-American relations. In the past, now we are witnessing almost the 80th anniversary of the strategic alliance between Riyadh and DC, Washington. The equation was before security for oil, but now it seems the relations are much more diverse, much more updated. Like, do you think the two countries are able to really renew, to update the strategic alliance?
Well, I think you make a good point. The relationship is broadened. It's more, in some ways, as the reality of Saudi Arabia has evolved. So it's more than simply energy-based. United States produces enormous amounts of gas and oil. Saudi Arabia is an important producer, but it's not, if you will, a swing producer in the way that it used to be, because the energy markets have changed. And I think the United States and Saudi Arabia see each other now in broader economic terms and in broader strategic terms. And I think this visit takes place in that evolved context.
When it comes to Gaza plan, I think, as you mentioned already, it's been adapted, I mean, by UN Security Council resolution, 20 points plan, and there are a lot of issues, a lot of questions about the implementation of this plan. Do you think this plan could be implemented?
You would have to be an optimist. So look, it's a 20-point plan. What we've seen so far, essentially, is the return of the hostages, as you know, the living hostages as well as remains. We've seen the freeing of Palestinian prisoners. We've seen a very uneasy, tenuous, incomplete ceasefire. To get beyond this, I think, will be difficult, particularly if it requires the quote-unquote disarming of Hamas. I have some experience with the process of disarming. I was the U.S. envoy for Northern Ireland. We called it decommissioning. It's difficult to bring about, and it's difficult to verify. And so I am skeptical of the Hamas's willingness to participate in a process of disarmament. I am skeptical of any ability to verify it if they claim they had. And I also worry that not enough is being done to marginalize Hamas politically. The idea that everything has to be done in the security realm before anything can be done in the political realm, I think is a mistake. I think it needs to be done simultaneously, because the way to reduce Hamas's influence is not simply through militarily weakening them. That's happened. It's to showing that there's a better path to achieving political goals, and that's the path through moderation and compromise and diplomacy, rather than the path that Hamas has chosen. But the approach of this agreement is more sequential than simultaneous, and I question, therefore, I hope I'm wrong, but I question whether it will go far.
You mentioned, I just was today, I was with a British diplomat in the morning, and they mentioned that they shared some ideas with the some American officials on the experience of Northern Ireland. So, and you were involved in this process. I mean, it was a success story, Northern Ireland. So what is the main differences between the two models, Gaza and Ireland?
Well, there's many differences in the specifics, but I would say for our purposes in this conversation, what was essential in Northern Ireland was the British demonstrated that the various paramilitary groups, principally the Provisional IRA, were not going to be able to shoot their way to power. They would not achieve their goals through the use of force. And that was done through the use of British police and military forces over the course of 3 decades. But at the same time, and this was the insight above all of Tony Blair and Jonathan Powell, who's now the British National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, at the same time, a diplomatic path was introduced. And that led in 1998 to the so-called Good Friday or Belfast Agreement. And that provided a serious roadmap for Northern Ireland. And it was the combination of the two. So again, it was frustrating those who wanted to use force, but also opening up a serious political diplomatic pathway. It wasn't going to give people all they wanted as soon as they wanted, but it would give them more than they would ever get by using force. We do not have an analogous situation in Gaza. So far, at least, the Israelis have introduced the military dimension, but because of the physical nature of Gaza, I don't believe that it can accomplish as much there as the British were able to accomplish in Northern Ireland. But more important, there has been no real introduction, again, of a political component, of a diplomatic component. If you look at the 20-point plan, talk about the Palestinian state is extremely vague, and it raises more questions than it answers.
In speaking about it, please.
No, and you also have a situation where Hamas is uninterested in a two-state outcome, as is the current Israeli government. So the impediments to diplomatic progress in this situation are considerably greater than they were in Northern Ireland.
Speaking about political horizon, speaking about political component, the UN Security Council resolution mentioned at the introduction, like Palestinian state, which made the Israeli Prime Minister very angry. In your recently, you've just written an article saying that establishing a Palestinian state is in the interest of Israel. Would you please elaborate on this?
Yeah, I mean, the argument I made in the article you're referring to, which appeared in the magazine Foreign Affairs recently, said that a Palestinian state, properly conditioned, so it didn't constitute a security threat to Israel, would be good, obviously, for Palestinians, but also for Israelis. If Israel wants to have security, if Israel wants to be a Jewish country, if it wants to be a democracy, if it wants to have good relations over the decades with the United States and the West, I believe it would benefit from having a Palestinian state, or at least benefit from showing that it was not the impediment to a Palestinian state. If Palestinian behavior made a Palestinian state impossible, so that any reasonable person would say, yet again, they've been given an opportunity, and yet again, they've kicked it away, which they've done, as you know, more than once in their history, that's one thing. But right now, at least, the Israelis are not checking that box. They're not putting forward a process that could lead to a Palestinian state. And again, if one wants Israel to be a secure, prosperous, Jewish democracy embedded in the West, I think it has a far better chance of accomplishing that goal if there is a good faith effort to create a Palestinian state. And that's the argument I made in the piece. And what I wanted to do, quite honestly, was change the conversation. So often when people talk about a Palestinian state, it's quote unquote good for Palestinians, and it's almost portrayed as a price Israel has to pay. And what I wanted to say is, yeah, it's obviously good for Palestinians, but also I believe it's good for Israelis if the state is properly conditioned. And we'll see over time whether what I was suggesting does enter the conversation more broadly. And my guess is in Israel after the election sometime next year, there's the possibility, or maybe even during the election campaign, I expect you'll have more of a conversation about some of these issues.
We are speaking about disarming Hamas. We are speaking about Gaza. We're talking about Trump plan, UN's new Security Council resolution. In a way, all is because, in a way or another, because of 7th of October. After the atrocities committed by Hamas 2 years ago, now we're here, we're talking about all these issues. No. How much do you think the whole 7th of October attacks, atrocities have changed the Middle East?
Well, I believe the 7th October events changed the Middle East largely because of the 8th of October and the 2 years since. 7th of October were a terrible day for the Middle East, for Palestinians, for Israelis, immediately for Israelis, because 1,200 or so got murdered and another 240 or 50 or so were taken hostage. And it hardened Israeli opinion badly seriously about Palestinians. But what's happened since is strategically the most significant. And if you think about the last 2 years, I would argue they are the most important 2 years in the Middle East, probably since 1967 or 48. If you look at what's happened in Syria, you look at the weakening of Hezbollah, you look at the physical weakening of Hamas. Above all, you look at the weakening of Iran. This has been a truly historic 2 years. And it's changed the geopolitical map of the region in Israel's favor. It's weakened Iran's hand. It's weakened the hand of Iran, both directly, but also its proxies. In some ways, it exposed the limits of Iranian power, probably created opportunities for others, beginning also Turkey, for example, to perhaps have more power. But I think the principal beneficiary is Israel, even though it began with the horrific events of October 7th. And the real question going forward is what comes of it. You mentioned the UN resolution and so forth. The question is whether we take what I see as the fascinating consequences of the last 2 years and work with them and take advantage of them and use them as an opportunity, or whether it's squandered.
So what is the best way, you think, sir? I will ask you a bit later on Iran, but what is the best way to take benefit out of this strategic shift in Middle East?
Well, with the weakening of Iran, with the weakening of its proxies, Hezbollah, I would say you want to continue to normalize relations between Israel and its neighbors, but you're not going to have additional normalization, it would seem, without significant progress being made on the Israeli-Palestinian front, both in Gaza and the West Bank. So I would say the principal way to take advantage of this is to emphasize diplomacy right now. And again, we've talked about the 20-point plan. My concern about it is that it's too sequential, security first, then diplomatic, and it's too vague. And I don't believe this Israeli government is politically prepared to take advantage of this opening that, if you will, October 8th has created. And the question is whether the United States will play a larger role. I don't know if the United States is prepared to. What we've seen is a start, but a lot more would have to be done in fleshing out and filling out the ideas about what we believe is a fair and reasonable and desirable settlement. And it would also mean, speaking of the word settlement in another way in English, that we would discourage building an expansion of settlements, which prejudice the possibility for diplomacy and so forth. I don't believe that this Israeli government is prepared, left to its own devices, to take advantage, in the best sense of the word, of the opportunities that have been created over the past 2 years. I believe this is now up to the United States. And I think it's an open question about the scale of the ambitions the United States will now pursue. My concern is if things don't, it's almost like riding a bicycle. If things don't move forward, then they go backwards. Mm-hmm. And one will see the re-strengthening or the reconstitution of Hamas. Will continue not to have any serious moderate Palestinian alternative. Israel will drift even further to the right. And, to switch metaphors yet again, windows don't stay open forever. So if a window has been created over the last 2 years, I want to take advantage of it.
I think you wrote recently that in a way Iran collapsed quickly, in a way, faster than expected.
Yeah.
And who do you think, which was more damaging to Iran, the collapse of Assad regime or the weakening of Hezbollah, you think?
I think the latter. The Assad regime was a reality that Israel had largely learned to coexist with over the last, 50 years. And there were certain rules of the road, certain understandings, particularly with the father, slightly less so with the son. But again, a certain modus vivendi had developed between the two. Hezbollah was a much bigger strategic problem for Israel because the whole idea was the conventional thinking was that Hezbollah was the force that allowed Iran, if you will, to deter Israel from doing certain things against Iran itself. That Hezbollah tied down a large part of the Israeli military, and because of all the rockets that Hezbollah possessed, that it was a kind of deterrent against Israeli actions in the region. And by the total weakening of Hezbollah, what essentially Israel did was not quite, but came close to eliminating the principal instrument of Iranian foreign policy against Israel. So I actually think this was a truly critical, historic development. I would say the two big developments of the last year, if you will, were that from Israel, that worked in Israel's favor. One was Hezbollah. The other was the exposure of the weakness of Iran itself, that Iran proved unable to defend its own territory, that essentially Israel could act with considerable freedom.
So Iran has been weakened.
Yeah.
The axis of resistance, quote unquote, being weakened. And of course, the nuclear program being pushed back. And what is the best way you think now to use this and capitalize on it? And what is the best way to deal with the Iranian nuclear program?
Yeah, there's a debate going on, and two things about Iran. One is about the potential for regime change or systemic change there. I would like to see it, but I'm skeptical. And the other is, the Iranian nuclear program has clearly been set back significantly, but it's not been eliminated. And my bet is, I haven't seen evidence, but my bet is that many Iranians will reach the conclusion that they need the nuclear program. That the lesson of events over the last year is that they might not have happened, or they might not have happened the same way if Iran had a strong nuclear weapons capability.
Which means North Korea model in a way.
Absolutely. So my fear, or my concern, I guess is a better word, is that Iran will go to great lengths to reconstitute a nuclear weapons program. And it will try to do it in a way that we do not learn about it, and it will try to do it in a way that American and Israeli military forces can't reach it. This suggests, deep underground, undisclosed locations, no cooperation whatsoever with the IAEA. And it won't happen immediately, but we're talking about years. But one has to think in years when it comes to national security and foreign policy. So that is my concern. That we have set back the challenge, but we haven't eliminated it or solved it. And at some point, that's a conversation. It's an interesting foreign policy issue, which is whether we should be prepared to talk with Iran in an effort to prevent the reemergence of a nuclear weapons program. And we would then have to think about what we would be prepared potentially to offer Iran in exchange. In the way, for example, of sanctions relief and so forth. I haven't thought that through, but I'm worried about a foreign policy from the United States and Israel that simply leaves all the initiative to Iran now. Yes, Iran has been shown to be weak, but I don't want to wake up one day in 5 or 10 years that Iran has reconstituted a nuclear program and presents us with a fait accompli. So my instinct is, and again, I haven't thought this through completely, would be to design a diplomatic initiative with Iran that essentially says, we are open to having at least a limited relationship with you in the economic realm, diplomatically, but here's what we require in the way of behavior on the nuclear front that can be verified by the IAEA or whomever. But I would, in principle, I am open to such a conversation.
We're talking about the Iran strategic shift in the region which is the biggest since 1979. And several developments in the last few years. Now, if we zoom out a little bit, like it seems that the whole regional structure that we know the last 25 years is in a way is changing a bit. Second, America, and you were involved with the government and then in the think tank, I mean, one of the biggest think tanks in the States. Always America was involved in terms of ideas, diplomacy, with initiatives. Are you happy now with the way that the American diplomacy being conducted?
Am I happy? I'm so rarely happy. I wake up in the morning and I worry. Look, I applaud the role the United States played in finally bringing a ceasefire in Gaza. As I mentioned to you a few minutes ago, I am concerned about the structure of the 20-point plan, and I have questions about how prepared the administration is to follow up on it. Because left to its own devices, it's not going to succeed. So, and second of all, we just talked about Iran, about the possibility of the desirability of a diplomatic initiative there. So I've got questions. And what I think are the two big issues. I think more broadly, when it comes to the Middle East for the United States, it's not clear where the Middle East fits in American national security. Indeed, if you think about it, you've got 3 or 4 principal theaters or regions in the world: the Asia Pacific, Europe, the Middle East, Latin America. And yes, this administration has been somewhat involved in the Middle East, obviously, the joining in the attack on Iran's nuclear installations, the diplomacy in Gaza. But there's real questions about what comes next. In the meantime, we've pulled back, not completely, but partially from Europe. There's questions about what we're prepared to do in Asia, and there's a much greater emphasis on the Western Hemisphere. As we have this conversation, you've got an aircraft carrier task force, and I don't know what, 10, 15,000 U.S. troops in the neighborhood of Venezuela. So the approach of the United States to the world is clearly evolving. And it's not, and since we're talking about the Middle East, I would simply say it's not obvious to me, at least, where the Middle East will stand in terms of how much attention it gets and what kind of attention, military, diplomatic, economic. What we seem to be seeing is a greater emphasis on the economic, with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other countries, a greater approach. And that's true, by the way, around the world. What we're seeing is an administration across the board that is emphasizing economic interests as it sees them. We can have debates about the wisdom of how it's going about them with tariffs and the like, but let's put that aside. But we're seeing an emphasis on economics in the Middle East and in other regions. And I think it's an open question what the United States is prepared to do in either the security domain or in the diplomatic domain down the road.
The U.S. been involved in the last 25 years in the Middle East in wars like the invasion of Iraq, and diplomacy like the peace process between the Arabs and the Israelis. And in a way, at a certain point, you are part of this diplomacy. Are you happy? Are you satisfied with the American legacy in the Middle East?
No. I thought then, I think now, the 2003 Iraq War was a historic error. It was, to me, an unfortunate war of choice, a textbook example of American overreach, and that also in some ways destabilized the region. It clearly brought about several decades that were very helpful to Iran. So I thought that was unfortunate. Also, by the way, soured a lot of Americans on internationalist foreign policy. I think it had real implications here. So I thought we erred there. I also thought more recently we erred by getting out the way from Afghanistan, but that's a different conversation. And I don't think we've been involved over the years enough to promote Israeli-Palestinian diplomatic progress. The Abraham Accords were a useful accomplishment, but the whole idea that you could sideline or ignore the Palestinian issue, that myth was exposed, or that assumption was exposed on October 7th. And so I believe, and the United States has been way too passive, for example, I would argue, in looking the other way at Israeli settlement activity.
Mhm.
So I wish the United States would be more involved in a more sustained way in the region diplomatically. I think that would be helpful. In other ways, by the way, that I think it's been useful for us, the whole fracking revolution in some ways left us less dependent on events in the Middle East. So it freed us up a little bit from what was going on in this part of the world.
As you just said a while ago, America is shifting focus to China, to Asia, and to now, more recently, to the Caribbean Sea, right?
Yeah.
So if I may borrow your like some headlines of the titles of your books. So is America now what, policeman or empire?
My sense is increasingly neither. I wrote a book, The Reluctant Sheriff, years ago. I would say U.S. foreign policy is hard to describe now in a single word, but it is more reluctant, certainly in terms of military intervention and commitments, alliance commitments. There's a new emphasis, an unprecedented emphasis on economic interests. The United States has become more unilateral, or unilateralist in its behavior. It's very suspicious of global arrangements, and as we've discussed, there's a surprising emphasis on the Western Hemisphere, an emphasis we haven't seen really for 200 years. And so this is an American foreign policy very much in flux. It's different in significant ways. I harbor profound doubts about the wisdom of a lot of it, I'll be honest. But we are seeing something that potentially is the biggest departure in American foreign policy in a century. We've had enormous continuity for 80 or so years since World War II, or 85 years, including World War II, where the United States was involved heavily in Europe and in Asia, really for 85 years now. And the question is, does this remain the case? And if not, what do we choose to do? So I actually, again, history is unfolding, so it's too soon to write it. But the fact we could have this conversation suggests to me that a lot of the givens, a lot of the assumptions of the last eight and a half decades may not hold going forward.
But could you help me to understand one thing, which is we all know that the U.S., the Trump administration is very much isolationist. I don't know if I pronounce it yet.
The word is isolation. I don't think it is. I think it's.
But at the same time, they attacked Iran, and now they are deploying fighter jets, carriers in the Caribbean Sea. Is it? So what is it? What is the name?
Again, I don't think isolationism is a good word to describe the Trump foreign policy, because it's not isolationist. What you're seeing is a shift in focus, which is something different, and you're seeing a shift in how the United States carries out its foreign policy. The shift in focus is much less focused on Europe. Asia remains a question mark, and much more focused on the Western Hemisphere. We see a greater emphasis on economic interests as opposed to diplomatic or strategic interests. And we see a penchant, a tendency to act more unilaterally rather than collectively. So it's a very different foreign policy, but I don't think isolationism is an accurate description.
So does that mean it's like the US is conducting as a regional power instead of superpower?
It's too soon to make such a statement. Again, there's a school of thought that thinks what you're suggesting could prove to be right, that the United States will pull back into more of a Western Hemisphere power and have less to do with Europe or the Middle East or Asia, except for economic ties. That's possible. It's premature to conclude that. We still have a military with global reach and global presence. We have all sorts of relationships and interests. But again, there's been a certain, shall we say, consistent deference to Russia in Europe. We'll see what evolves with China. President Trump will be visiting China reportedly in the first half of next year. We'll see what comes of his summit with Xi Jinping. But this is a possibility that we do move more, not completely, but it's a question of emphasis, to a world of so-called spheres of influence, where the United States focuses on its neighborhood, Russia and Europe battle it out in their neighborhood, and China and other countries like Japan, South Korea, and so Australia, with a degree of American participation, find a balance in their part of the world. It's possible that we're looking at a world in which the American role, the American footprint, is smaller going forward than it has been over the last 8 decades. That's a possibility.
So it's interesting that I think that that this description of having sphere of influence, world order in a way, right? So China has its own, Russia, Europe, America has its own. So in terms of definition, what is your favorite definition? Now we know the Cold War was over like 30 years ago, more, and then we had like the New World Order led by America. And now, what is your definition of the New World Order? Is it G2 or
No,
or
not G2.
or
G2
multiple?
I don't accept phrases like G2 because power is much too broadly distributed. So I think people who speak about a G2 get it wrong. No, I can't answer your question because it's very much being determined. You're right. It's 35 years since the end of the Cold War. And the period, since then, it's largely been a period or an era, 20, 25 years, 30 years of American primacy. Now we're moving towards or into something else, but it's too soon to say with confidence what that something else is. For what it's worth, I'm writing a book about it. But it could go in lots of different ways. So it's almost like driving in a car. It's easier to see where we're coming from, where we've been, than it is where we're driving towards.
What are the options? What are the scenarios for this new thing that's coming?
There's all sorts of options. From the United States could try to reestablish dominance to China could try. You could have some type of a U.S.-China or U.S.-China-Russia Cold War. You could have spheres of influence. You could have a truly disorderly world. You could have a world of growing violence and so forth, where no one is in a position to maintain order. There are lots of possibilities. Again, it's too soon to speak with confidence or clarity. What's interesting, though, is we know what we're moving away from. We don't know exactly what we're moving towards, but this is a moment in which history, you have a sense, at least I have a sense, that history is unfolding. That, it used to be for 8 decades, we'd wake up every morning and we had a pretty good idea of what the world would look like. The headlines would change from day to day. I get that. But they would change within certain parameters, within certain structures. What's different today is the parameters and the structures could well be changing. So there's a much greater range, a much greater potential for big change now than there has been at any time since World War II.
Two quick questions, and then I will be done. One is that, are you suggesting that the whole world is heading to the unknown era?
It will become known. I think it's premature. The United States, Russia, China, others have to make some big decisions. And governments need to, what's the word? Absorb these changes, need to think them through. They may do some probes. I don't think, it's not obvious to me that any of the major actors has decided on what its foreign policy or national security policy will be for the next decade or next few decades. So again, I think it's a moment of transition. We just don't know transition to what.
You know, I am Syrian. I am from Syrian origin. I am Syrian British. Trump met with Ahmad al-Shara, who was former Al-Qaeda leader. What do you think?
My training, I'm both a historian and a diplomat. So in principle, I support meeting with people. I've never thought of diplomacy as a favor. I see diplomacy as a tool, as an instrument. So my question about the meetings between the President of the United States and the new Syrian leadership is about what is it we're going to ask for? What's not clear to me is the willingness to reach out to the new Syrian leadership. What are the conditions? What is it we want from them as a prerequisite for interaction? And it seems to me we've been very generous, I'll put it that way, in reaching out to the new leadership. If I had been advising, I would have required, shall we say, certain demonstrations of behavior beforehand to get a meeting. And then obviously I would have certain requirements in order to move forward. So I thought this was, it may turn out fine, but I thought the path we've taken was, it was not sufficiently conditional. I would have structured it more if I had been advising.
Last question will be, so if we just, for, you know, because our readers are from the Arab world, from Middle East, and like from some parts of the world, if we want like to have good, like if we want to draw a map or structure about the new Middle East, the new world order, how would you describe it?
I'm not sure.
How do you see the new Middle East structure?
Of the Middle East.
As a part of a new world structure.
Okay, so it's a good question. Let me think about it. Look, the new Middle East, I find it hard to speak about the Middle East as a single region now. You have very weak regional institutions, very weak. And you have such a range of countries, from the large population, troubled country like Egypt, to the small population, wealthy countries in the Gulf, to countries to failed countries like, Libya, or quasi-failed countries like Lebanon, Yemen, and so forth. So I find it very hard to generalize about the Middle East. It's a region I understand in the geographic sense. It's not entirely a region in the economic or geopolitical sense. And the one of the words that comes to mind, I don't know how it translates in Arabic, is unevenness. It's very hard to make generalizations about it. My overall sense, though, about the region, and I first went to the Middle East over 50 years ago. My first trip to the Middle East was 1971. So I guess that makes me both experienced and old. Is that the center of gravity in the region has shifted. for much of my career, when I would visit the Middle East, work with the Middle East, whether I was in government or in think tanks, now I do business, the center of the Middle East was really, it was Egypt, it was Lebanon, it was Syria, it was Jordan,
Baghdad.
Pardon me?
Baghdad.
Baghdad, as you say, Baghdad, and then Iran. But you had sort of what we used to call the confrontation states, around Israel and the confrontation states. And then you had Iran and Iraq as kind of the outer circle. That's no longer true. Much more the center of gravity has moved to the Gulf. That to me is a historic change. It's a very different Middle East. And it's something that I'm trying to get my hands around to understand. I think the Middle East relations with the rest of the world are changing as well. The Middle East has never been the home to a great power. Rather, it was a region where the great powers intervened and competed. Obviously, U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And then you had local actors. Some were medium powers, Israel, Iran, at one point Egypt, Turkey. Some are, various groups, non-state actors, that the Hezbollahs and others that could have real impact. But the relationship now of the Middle East to the rest of the world, I think, is a little bit less central. The middle energy is still obviously important, but there's other big producers, and over the next 50 years, the role of alternatives will become more significant. And certain countries in the Middle East are having real problems of internal governance. Syria, Libya, Egypt, Lebanon, and Yemen, and so forth. So they can't have an impact beyond their borders. They're not functioning well. And and increasingly with the Saudis and the UAE and other countries, more and more of the interaction's economic. And the big challenges for these countries is more and more development and modernization and putting into place some elements of a post-energy dependent economy. So I think this is a very different era in the Middle East. You still have geopolitics. We've been talking about it, but you also have some real changes within the region, and you have a new emphasis, I think, on economic development, more, if you will, economic modernization more than political modernization. So it's Middle East is interesting as always. It's just interesting in different ways.
Great. And Mr. Richard Hess, thank you so much. It's been a great interview. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Mr. Richard Hess, for giving this interview for us in Al Majalla. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Be well.
Yes, thank you.